Hello, thanks everyone. Today I'm recording my talk about OpenAPI extensibility. So this is a recording of the talk from API Day Paris on December 6th. And yeah, let's talk about extensibility. And if you use OpenAPI, most likely you already use extensions. But when I ask, almost nobody knows what the extensions are. And today I will just do a really quick introduction. And one thing, if I'm coughing, sorry, because I just recovered from pneumonia and I'm not infectious. And anyway, you're watching it on YouTube, so you're totally safe. Okay, so what OpenAPI extensions are? So basically, in every OpenAPI specification definition, you can put additional tag or object, like starting from X prefix that says, well, basically you add some additional content or metadata that carries information and then can be processed by your service. So basically, if you build a product that uses OpenAPI, that produces OpenAPI, you can inject additional data that can be used for various purposes. And these can be just a string or object data. And this is what this engine is about. So it's quite simple. At the same time, it's quite difficult to use it because there is a lot of different use cases. There is a lot of vendors using extensions in different ways. So for me as a maintainer, it has been quite difficult to actually do some alignment and to reuse OpenAPI specifications produced by other tools, which of course fits the purpose of OpenAPI, because OpenAPI as a standard is supposed to be the same or more or less the same. In practice, it's not exactly the case. So many vendors define different extensions, sometimes for very basic purposes like authorization, authentication. So like here, also, the problem is that all the documentation is quite outdated. So extensions were designed for Swagger something like 6 years ago, and since that they haven't changed, and they haven't changed basically literally. There have been no updates for more than 6 years. So I'm talking about Open API extensions. We will just dive what they're about and how they could be improved and what the problems you can experience as an adopter of Open API. So I hope this talk will be interesting to you. And one thing I want to mention that is not a vendor talk. While I'm employed by WireMock, I don't represent any vendor, and I speak about community experiences and user experiences. And my main goal is to show what are the problems from the OpenAPI standpoint and how we could improve it as a community. So my name is Oleg Nenashev. Most likely you know me from the Jenkins project. I have been with it for 10 years or so. I'm a governance board member and co-maintainer. And I've been around in open source and developer tooling space for more than a decade. So currently I consult for WireMock. I still contribute to Jenkins, to test containers, to a few other projects like OpenFeature. I've recently created test containers for C, C++, and I'm basically an author of many plugins for Jenkins, including some that involve OpenAPI specification. I'm a CNCF ambassador, CDF ambassador, and a member of a few other foundations. So again, I would like to say thanks to OpenAPI initiative that sponsored my participation in API Days Paris, to WireMock for donating the working time for that. So let's get started. So one thing I want to repeat that I'm OpenAPI end user. While I do some development, most of the time I just use this specification, extend this specification as other end users would do. And what OpenAPI extensions are. So if you go to the website, you can actually see quite a lot of information there. Well, not that much, but there is a page, and it basically says that there are multiple ways to define specifications in different fields. And then there are a few examples of how you do that. So basically, this is whole documentation available on OpenAPI, and yeah, it literally fits 2 slides. So this slide, and basically that's it. And the problem is that it's definitely not enough. There are some examples which provide a little bit more information, but ultimately the OpenAPI expansions are used differently from how they were designed. And another problem that they were designed actually long ago, and it's literally quite long ago. So for example, if you open GitHub, you can see that the last update to open API extension definition was more than 6 years ago. And there is no official documentation for V3. Actually, after the talk, when I was reviewing it with foundation members, I discovered that there is a little bit of specification on another website, but this little bit of specification is not aligned with what's written in other location, and basically it's even shorter than it was before. So yeah. Basically, it's your choice to decide what is the official source, but ultimately there is not enough information, and this information is still misused. So for example, there is a list of fields where the specification can be used. So for example, info objects, tag objects, responses, parameters, but nobody cares. If you use specifications, you can discover these extensions basically everywhere as objects, as subfields. You can see them in arrays where they're not supposed to be just additional objects attached. So it's quite complicated. And basically, if you parse OpenAPI specification, you just have to either ignore any X entry or somehow process that. And the problem is that many vendors actually put a lot of information into these X fields. So putting a few kilobytes of metadata is perfectly fine. Putting all common data like descriptions, examples to X data is also fine. For example, maybe they use it for custom documentation generators. So I saw Markdown formatted docs being included in X extensions. And also, some people go beyond and cosplay Microsoft. Maybe you remember times of when docx was introduced, a kind of open standard for documentation that would use XML format. But actually, Microsoft, what they did, they put all the data of Microsoft Word to encrypt the sections within this XML. So it's basically unusable in the beginning until they did some changes, until people reverse engineered that. So basically defeated the purpose of open specification. And unfortunately, some vendors, I won't be finger pointing in this presentation, do that. And this is not something that is aligned with the purpose. And of course, for many items, like common items like authorization, we would like to see these bits to be included in the specification, but most of the vendors that use OpenAPI don't contribute back, and most of information still stays within the extensions, while it's not supposed to be like that. So this is just a common state, and when I was using OpenAPI in my projects, actually I experienced a few more issues. So I would like to briefly share my experiences with that. So the first project is Jenkins. In Jenkins, we actually used Swagger since maybe 2014 or so. It has been one of our ways to describe specification, and Jenkins is one of the most popular automation frameworks in the world. It has more than 2,500 repositories, more than 900 plugins by now. It's fully open source. It has a huge community of users, developers, maintainers, and this community actually invests a lot into improving Jenkins. And a part of these improvements is actually addressing new demands. For example, recently we got expectations about APIs, configuration as code, DevOps, Docker, shift left. So this is basically all the keywords that became an expectation, let's say, about 10 years ago. Well, APIs were around a little bit earlier. But the problem is that for projects like Jenkins, it's difficult to move forward because there is huge legacy code base, often not enough maintainers, contributors to make changes. And at the same point, we still need to move forward and address so many demands, sometimes contradicting each other. So for us, it has been obvious that we cannot do everything alone. And we decided that instead of Jenkins focusing on itself, focusing on its own integrations, etc., Jenkins should rather become a system that integrates well with other systems. It has been always a purpose of Jenkins as automation server. You wouldn't be able to integrate with pretty much every build tool, test automation tool, CD tool, and we wanted to continue that with external services. And of course, we used APIs to connect. So there were projects like Swagger Jenkins that generated Jenkins clients based on the OpenAPI specification before Swagger specification. Obviously, it has a lot of limitations, but the project is out there, it's being used. And many plugins in Jenkins actually provide OpenAPI definitions. For example, this is a screenshot of folder authorization plugin, but basically the same is available for many other plugins. The problem is that it's not a standard, it's a recommendation. So hundreds of plugins do not have any documentation for APIs. Some plugins have just text documentation, and I guess only about 50 have OpenAPI definitions. And it's too difficult to maintain these definitions in a JSON YAML form, because it's basically the separate definition format. You have a definition of your API in code documented, and then you have to reproduce it in the specification. For us at scale, it has been super difficult. So as I said, Jenkins has more than 1900 plugins. There are other components with APIs. There is infrastructure like update centers that also use APIs. So it's a big thing, and we couldn't maintain so many specifications, especially standalone files. So our idea was that we either update our in-house framework to use something more modern, like Spring Boot, Quarkus, Helidon. All of them can import and export OpenAPI specifications, or we update our technology stack to actually also support OpenAPI. But even in this case, we definitely didn't want YAML files to be present in the repositories. We would like to produce them completely from code. And we would like to produce them from code on demand based on configuration, on feature flags enabled, etc. And from a wider standpoint, we would like to generate it for a particular Jenkins instance, not for each plugin and not for each component individually. Because while it's perfect for models, it's not great for end users of our applications, and we would like to just provide a single specification that describes all available APIs, provides documentations, etc. for every instance our user runs, because every instance is different, and hence APIs is different, and hence specifications should be different too. So we did a few attempts to do that. We actually proposed a Google Summer of Code project. We had a few students exploring this, sharing feedback, etc. That would allow to do automatic generation of our frameworks. Ultimately, this project hasn't been completed by now, because there is quite a lot of complexity if you want to do it right. We had a few students. These projects created proof of concepts, but that's it. So it's not production ready. But still, during these projects, we tried to use extensions, and extensions were used basically for many things, including some like authorization model, feature flags, conditional behavior. So, for example, if you have configuration set by user, if you have particular state of the plugin or particular state of the build, and all the statefulness, conditions, various features, authorization model, and many other things. I would say they are supposed to be a part of the specification, but the problem is that they're not. And every vendor has actually to implement basically the same extensions for very basic functionality. So pretty much every service in the world has an authorization engine at the moment, but OpenAPI specification doesn't support it. Feature flags are widely adopted technology, but OpenAPI specification doesn't support them. And this is a big problem. And this is a big problem not for extensions and OpenAPI extension engine in general. For me, it's a problem for the specification. And I believe that the specification would need to be improved and to actually support these use cases. So it's either OpenAPI specification being improved as is, or as many other mentioned the conferences, for example, Eric Wilder, that we should rather introduce a marketplace for standard OpenAPI extensions. So, for example, you do authorization extension, it gets voted by OpenAPI Initiative, a technical steering committee, and then it is included as official extension that is recommended for the implementation by vendors, probably even without X-Flag, something differently, but this is what would actually help. Another thing that, as I said, we don't want to use JSONs, YAMLs. Instead of that, we actually want to generate specifications from code. And at the moment, OpenAPI doesn't provide a standard way to do that. So you have to generate specification on your own from your code. And for every framework, like Quarkus, like Micronaut, or for example, Fast API, if you use Python and basically any other framework, you would need to implement it from scratch. And this is not great. Instead of that, I would rather prefer to have YAML or JSON specifications only as an inter-exchange format, like as bombs, but SPDX, but not the format that would be actually kept in the repositories, because it's difficult to maintain. And I would expect that the most specifications would be generated by tools, and that there would be a DSL language and a set of tools that actually allows to use this DSL language in your projects to generate the specifications and to not spend as much time as generating everything from scratch. So this is what would be perfect. It's not there, but in Jenkins, we would definitely benefit from that on our scale. Another project where I participated in OpenAPI extensions is WireMock Cloud. So I will briefly go to the proprietary space, but again, only as an end user. So for me, and for many other users, APIs are actually essential for integration testing. There is a lot of projects that address integration testing use cases on OpenAPI landscape, on Apidays landscape, and this is right. So WireMock is just one of these tools. It's basically open source project. It's super popular in Java, but it's available in other ecosystems like Python, Rust, Golang. It has more than 5 million downloads. And its idea is to actually isolate environments and to handle incoming requests and provide responses without actually having a real server. So let's say you have a protocol like HTTP, gRPC, GraphQL, you send a request, and such a service can query this request, do some request matching, for example, filters, arguments, form parameters, so decide how to handle that, and then generate response and send to it. So basically, these are what tools like WireMock are about. They're normally configured either via JSONs, YAMLs, or code. And you can see that in these formats, there is actually quite a lot of relevance to OpenAPI, because here you can also see request, response, like an OpenAPI. You can see some types, some body information being injected. And actually, it's pretty similar to OpenAPI specification does. And actually, many tools, including WireMock Cloud, leverage OpenAPI to generate mock definitions and mock services. So yeah, there is quite a lot of advanced features. It's not just if then else, so there might be request matching, templating. You can record protocols, reverse engineer specifications, or use it, for example, for chaos engineering purposes, for injecting failures or delays or whatever. So this is what we do in WireMock. This is other vendors do in open source or proprietary projects, and all these projects integrate with many things, including WireMock, and OpenAPI is one of the things. So let's how we use OpenAPI. Right now, OpenAPI is mostly used in WireMock Cloud, so it's enterprise product based on WireMock, and it's designed not just as a test tool, but rather as a developer portal and co-development tool, which allows to develop both OpenAPI and mock APIs at the same time. So basically, how we position it is mock-driven API development, which you can do basically at all stages, even before your implementation becomes a thing. So this is what we do. and for that, we basically can take OpenAPI specifications and we can convert them to the form of mock APIs. So there is a blog post from me that explains how to do that. We also have a marketplace of existing specifications. So this marketplace was created from APIs Guru. This is a public repository of OpenAPI definitions, and we used WireMock Cloud to process OpenAPI definitions to restore the logic behavior, and then to generate mock definitions from that. So there are more than 2,000 specifications for different services, so then you can see and reuse. So some items are quite empty, some are not so empty. So this is APIs you can find, you can reuse, and there is a lot of basically generated data. And here you can see that this data again is quite similar to what you have in OpenAPI specifications. So there is request, response, there are some additional metadata injected. So basically what would be called OpenAPI extension in OpenAPI space. So yeah, there is quite a lot of things. And here you have content and then we basically generate some specification and allow to develop that. Features we support, yeah, importing and actually bidirectional modification. So you can modify either OpenAPI or mock API. You can do some bits independently, like responses, and then WireMock Cloud can merge it, everything, and basically synchronize formats between each other. And we also can do request response validation, contract testing, and we can generate OpenAPI API specifications basically from dumps from configurations. For that, of course, we use some OpenAPI extensions to support development. So one of extensions is a Faker extension that allows us to define random data, because when you develop specification, you need to define what would be the possible ranges of data, what would be the distribution of data, etc. It's really important when you deploy mock APIs, but at the moment the specification doesn't support that. So we inject this metadata. Another thing is parameter values, because at the moment in OpenAPI 3 examples, you cannot say to which request this example is related to. So we need to inject some metadata to connect them with each other, and it sometimes becomes complicated when you have parameters, etc. And last but not least, it's also a WireMock hash, which we actually use for tracking changes, unique IDs, and for regrouping the specifications. So it's an internal part. But one thing that really concerns me is X parameter values, because in my opinion, how come it's not a part of the specification? Because it's really straightforward. Many examples are actually used to demonstrate the behavior, and it should be clear what you need to send to receive this example response. It's clear, but it's not a part of the specification. And any vendor that implements mock APIs, they basically have to reverse engineer OpenAPI specification, for example, definitions of parameters, response data. Then, for example, if there are some IDs incoming, you need to guess where to put these IDs, for example, in URL path, in response body, etc. And all of this magic should be implemented. And it's not actually what we would like to do. For me, the key takeaway here is that OpenAPI v3 is again not enough for building mocks and code from them, because a lot of information is implicit and need to be reproduced. For that, there is a new project. Well, not so new, it's several years old. The project is called OpenAPI Moonwalk. So it's a project towards building a new version of this specification. And the goals are to implement to eliminate complexity, eliminate unclear behavior, because currently you can do OpenAPI definition in many ways, and some of these ways are actually no longer used to the historical background, or at the same time, for some use cases, you have to put a lot of additional metadata to implement them. Also, what actually anticipate is support different responses within the specification, connect basically parameters, headers, requests. So this is what I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Also supporting various kinds of URL design patterns. So it's not just parameters. You can pass multiple values. At the moment, you cannot implement it in OpenAPI specification. And there is also a lot of quality of life improvements, like supporting reuse of patterns. Right now, you can do it only with YAML references, or you can just remove nesting, etc., etc. So for that, there is a Moonwalk repository on GitHub, which you can see there is quite some activities going on, and there is a Slack channel that is also related to this specification. So you already can see a lot of stuff here. And I definitely hope that this project will be released soon, and that it will address at least some of the feedback I shared. So regarding my wish list, what I want to see, firstly, I want to see Moonwalk being released, because at the moment, yeah, it's still in the repository. There is a lot of ideas, but even what is already integrated, it would be valuable to the community. It would actually enable things to move forward, because OpenAPI 3 is basically Swagger. So for almost a decade, there has been not so many changes in the specification beyond very basic quality of life improvements. Then what I also would like to see, DSL for defining open APIs and specifications, adoption of popular extensions and creation a kind of marketplace for them, supporting common features like built-in authorization. It shouldn't be an extension. It should be a part of the specification. Security is important, and yes, it must be a part of the core spec. And another thing I could advise is actually learning from API modeling tools. So it's not just WireMock. There is a lot of other vendors that provide the same capabilities, that create mock APIs from OpenAPI templates, and they actually already resolved quite a lot of issues that should be normally a part of OpenAPI specification that should be integrated. What I didn't mention, and I would definitely like to see, is more collaboration between OpenAPI and Async API, because at the moment we have two very similar but standards, but in different organizations, different foundations. And I so appreciated that at API Days there is a booth for these projects where we could talk and discuss some community alignment topics, to collaborate and maybe to find a common ground and a platform to discuss few the integration of the standards between each other, and maybe even merging the standards, who knows. So this is my talk. Key takeaways: that OpenAPI extensions is definitely something to consider. This engine is available. This engine is super helpful. It allows to work around many downsides of the existing specification. At the same time, it's not how it's supposed to be. OpenAPI extensions, in many cases, they just work around. And there should be evolution of OpenAPI standard to remove complexity, remove many existing extensions, and adopt the most popular ones. And hopefully OpenAPI 4 or Moonwalk will actually change the things and make it easier. So it's always a great time to contribute. So OpenAPI initiative has a community Slack open to everyone. You can join. There are also contributing guidelines you can check out. So for example, if I take this link, if I go to the repository, you can actually see that there is quite a lot of information for adopters, for contributors and users, which you can actually use to get started with this specification and check out these resources. If you want to ask any questions, just ask me on the community Slack of OpenAPI Initiative or of WireMock. I'm on both of these channels and I'm happy to discuss it. And one thing, always, feedback is one of important ways of contributions, especially for Moonwalk. Right now, it's a great time to provide feedback and provide some examples, to do some prototyping, because it can help to actually move the ecosystem towards the new standard and make these improvements actually adopted within the ecosystem, where we already have tens and hundreds of thousands of OpenAPI implementations that need to be updated to new standards. So that's it. I hope it was helpful. Definitely, you're invited to cooperate, and if you build new tools, please share information about it with the community, because OpenAPI, as many other ecosystems, evolves thanks to its contributors and thanks to projects that get created by those who use the specification. So if you're interested, check out the participation guides, and thanks for your time. So if there are any questions, again, please come to the community Slack, and I'm happy to talk there.